Good morning and welcome to UK Column viewers and listeners. Delighted to have a very interesting guest with me today, gentleman who contacted me a couple of weeks ago as a result of a resignation letter. So my guest today is Job West, and he resigned recently as the local chairman for Reform, and this is in the Derbyshire area. And Job was very kind to send me a copy of his letter. And what we're going to do today is have a discussion around the reasons why he's resigned. And I've absolutely no doubt that that discussion is going to lead us into a little bit more detail and analysis around the we'll call them the opposition parties that have arisen in UK, which probably UKIP is one of the key ones. But Job, thank you very much for agreeing to come and do an interview with me today.
My pleasure. It's an honour to be with you.
Thank you very much. Well, I've learnt that you've actually been a follower of the UK column for some time. So would you share with the audience how did you find us and when was that?
Oh, a very long time ago. It was to do with the British Constitution Group, and I went to see you at Stoke many years ago. That whole movement I was involved with. I did think the British Constitution Group would lead the way, but it didn't. But then eventually, you sort of like turned into the UK column, and I started following the UK column to do with that. And I've been following you for years, and really, the level of information that you guys give out is the best in this country, without any doubt. And I do follow an awful lot of social media. I do follow an awful lot of channels. UK column's the best.
Thank you very much for those kind words. And I'll just say, yes, I also think the British Constitution Group did a lot of extremely good work. And but the key thing it was that it was never a party. It was a fairly loose group of individuals who had concerns about what was then seen quite rightly as an ongoing attack on the constitution and indeed system of law in this country. But it wasn't a political party. And UK Column gave a lot of support to that. And of course, we helped set up the conferences. And I think the biggest conference that I'll use the word we because it encapsulates everybody who was working hard at that stage. I think the biggest audience we had for one of those events was over 500. It was about 540. That could well have been the Stoke conference. So important things going on there. And well, wonderful that you should have found us. And we're still doing our best to push out information. A lady said to me a couple of days ago, the thing about the UK column news is it can be what she described as an information cascade, which I thought was a really interesting comment. Okay, well, your letter, which I have here, was dated the 10th of February, 2025. So obviously back in February, you were feeling uncomfortable with what was happening in the Reform Party and you decided to resign. Tell us what was happening.
It's best for me to tell you when I joined Reform, which was in 2021. Now, it was still under Richard Tice in those days, and Richard Tice had come out with a policy opposing vaccine passports. Now, at the time, that was a policy I strongly agreed with. I regard vaccine passports as a means to create a papers please society, a police state. And so I thought, well, that's great. Somebody's standing up against vaccine passports reform, as well as the Brexit thing. Obviously, the Brexit thing is very important to me because I was involved in UKIP before that, and I was involved in the referendum party before that. So leaving the European Union an essential political ambition as far as I was concerned for the British people. So I joined Reform back in 2021. I was selected to stand as the Reform UK candidate for South Derbyshire in the 2024 election. Very proud to do so, and over the moon that we inflicted, the damage that we did on the Conservative government. We got rid of the Conservative government, who I held in utter contempt for telling us lies years after year after year. So it was a wonderful thing. So I was over the moon in July, beg your pardon. This year, I got 9,000 votes, came third. But as I said, we managed to get rid of the sitting Conservative MP in South Derbyshire, a lady called Heather Wheeler. And even though we replaced her with Labour, I felt sure that the plan of the destruction of the Uni Party, which was to get rid of the Conservatives first and then go for Labour, was on track. Wonderful. September came along last year, and an event took place then where our county organiser was fired, which was a strange thing to happen because she was such a good county organiser, and every constituency in Derbyshire really liked her. All those who stood for general election, who then became party chairman of their local branches, really liked this lady. So that was an anomaly. And I want to point that out. It was a strange thing to happen because it does have a bearing on why I resigned in the following February. And this is why I need to go back in time to explain to your viewers what happened that led up to my resignation in February. Yeah, in the beginning of February, before Rupert and all the rest of them, I resigned first. Now, I will go to the next issue that came up, which was after the firing of our county organiser, wonderful lady. We then had the Richard Tice episode, where Richard Tice described supporters of Tommy Robinson as that lot. Okay. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not a Tommy Robinson supporter. Okay. I watched how the Tommy Robinson issue broke up UKIP back in 2018. I watched it happen. I saw how Richard Brame was basically kicked out from being the leader of the party, even though he was voted in, simply because he was trying to bring peace between the two factions of UKIP. So I'm not a Tommy Robinson man. But I had to respond to my members in my branch complaining to me that they wanted to cancel their memberships because Richard Tice had described them as that lot because they had sympathy for Tommy Robinson. So I got on to my members and I said, please don't leave us. Reform is the only game in town. You've got to stick with us. This is the only way that we're going to win this country back and have a sensible government. Please don't go. Now, one of the members who had wanted to cancel his membership was a retired coal miner from Swadlincote. And he said to me, look, I'll stick with you, Joe, but you've got to understand that all that Tommy Robinson is doing is trying to defend children. Yeah. So he said, have you seen the film that Tommy Robinson got into trouble about, which is called Silence? And I told him, no, I haven't seen this film. He said, well, will you watch the film if I stick with you? And I said, yes, I promise I will watch the film. Before I watched the film, I then rang up management because I wanted to know what the management policy was for this. Yeah. So I rang up management and I said, look, I've got people wanting to cancel their memberships. I said, what is the party line? How am I supposed to respond because Richard Tice has made this comment? So they turned around and they said to me, let them go. Don't bother with them. Just let them go. Zia has said that they're not wanted and that they're doing our vetting for us. Now, for me, that stuck in my craw at the time. Yeah, that was something I didn't like. All I could see was my old Swadlincote coal miner, who I knew in person and who'd been to branch meetings, yeah, being told that he's not wanted by some city boy, yeah, a Mohammedan and a Sri Lankan to boot, yeah. He doesn't want my old English coal miner to be a part of his party, right? Now, that didn't sit well, but I stuck with it. I just thought, okay, we've got to move on. For the sake of the unity of the party, we'll move further forward. Then the next issue that comes up was to do with vetting. And this may sound like it's a detail, but it's an important detail. We had to vet and make applications for all those who wanted to stand for county council in the upcoming county council elections. And some of these applications have been put in back in August. And I kept on asking my regional organizer, when are these vettings and these applications going to come through and be approved? Because we want to start making plans for who's going to stand in which ward, and how we're going to, start to manage our campaign collectively. Okay, we're fobbed off all the time. All the time we're fobbed off with, oh yeah, it'll be next week, or it'll be a couple of weeks' time. Don't worry about it. It's all in hand. Christmas comes and goes, and we still don't have these applications or these vettings approved. Okay. Now, I want your viewers to just park that to one side, because it is important. Now, the new year comes, we're still none the wiser. We've got, obviously, elections coming up in May and only months to prepare, and nobody knows who's going to stand in which wards and who's going to do what. I'm getting very frustrated, and I'm getting quite angry. The East Midlands Reform UK conference comes up in Leicester. I don't go. I've got better things to do. Yeah. But at that conference, a young man called Andrew Southall, who had stood in the general election in Dudley, was replaced in the conference, without him even knowing about it, by Marco Longhi, who was the sitting Conservative MP who had stood against reform in the general election and had been replaced by Labour. So I'm fuming. I'm thinking, well, that's wrong. Why have they done that to that young man? He's put in all the hard yards. He's done all the hard work. And they've gone and parachuted in the very Conservative who they tried to remove. Surely this is not part of the plan. Surely we're trying to remove these Conservatives, get rid of these people, because they're obviously the ones that's ruined the country. That happens on the 3rd of January. The big bombshell for me comes the following week. On the 10th of January, the whole of Amber Valley Reform UK leadership resign. Right now, I'd heard undercurrents about this. But they'd kept it secret to themselves until the moment when they'd all resigned. The reason why they resigned is because their leader, Alex Stevenson, had been suspended on December the 15th, unbeknownst to the rest of us. Yeah. And he himself hadn't found out to December the 29th, by Reform UK and by Zia. Yeah. Now, the thing about Amber Valley that I want all your viewers to bear in mind is they are the best Reform UK branch in Derbyshire, without a shadow of a doubt. Really enthusiastic, did loads of work. They had parish councillors, they had town councillors, they had county councillors. They had the whole shooting match going on. They even used to do litter picking drives. They were really well liked in the local community in a way that none of the other constituencies have been able to match. They were the best. In matter of fact, they could have even been the best in the East Midlands, but they were certainly the best branch in Derbyshire. They were targeted by the management deliberately and then wiped out. Now, that's a very important thing that I want your viewers to understand, is that the best branch in Derbyshire was deliberately targeted to be wiped out, to be decimated, to have its leadership removed. And I want you to understand that, because I believe that that is the intention for reform as a whole. The intention is to remove all the real reformers, all the best people in the party, all the real activists who've been with it for years, and replace them with either Tories, Lib Dems, Labour. They don't care, just so long as you're somebody who's really in it just for the political process rather than for the ideology of saving the country. They want professional politicians, which is why in my letter, which I wrote in the beginning of February, after giving due consideration to all these things that had gone on, yeah, and speaking to other people about the matter, I did give it plenty of counsel before I wrote this letter. I wrote my letter to Zia, and I said basically, your professionalization of the party is essentially the Toryisation of the party. That's what your intention is. Your intention is to remove all the real reformers, all the most dedicated and ideological of activists, and replace them with party men, with placemen, with people who are only in politics simply to feather their own nest. You know, the typical politician types, people who think, well, I'm in the local council. That means, I'm on the inside. I can get certain perks, as it was, to being a councillor, as well as the prestige. Those kind of people, the very kind of people that make politics in this country so bad and so corrupt. Yeah. And that's what this man, Zia Yusuf, was going about making sure that he was doing. He was going to put people in all of his branches, wherever he could, who weren't ideologues, who weren't true believers. He wanted people who were in it just for their own advantage.
Joe, thank you very much for giving us that introduction. And I think it is a key introduction. I think we can tell our audience, because for me it was very significant that when you kindly emailed through your letter of resignation, and I read it, and then we had a chat on the telephone. And one of the things that I said at the beginning of that conversation is, before you tell me your side of the story, let me tell you a few things that I experienced in UKIP. And I can say to the audience, I was involved with UKIP back in the very early days. So I think it was about 2002, or soon after. Roger Natman was the leader at that stage. There'd already been strife, and who was the other gentleman? Need my notes here. Kilroy Silk. He disappeared off and tried to form a new party called Veritas. But I initially had been looking myself for a party that was going to make proper change and fight back against what I saw as an organised destruction of the country. And UKIP was the direction that I went into. And what I then discovered was a series of events that happened, such that when I read your resignation letter, I was thinking, my goodness, this is like ticking off a template. So that's me setting a little bit of the scene, and I'll talk more about my own experiences. But let's come back onto your resignation letter itself, because it's a pretty strong letter. I don't know whether you've got a copy in front of you.
I haven't. You have. You lead the way.
Well, I think because we can more or less break it up into blocks, but you say in your second sentence that you don't have confidence in Nigel Farage as leader of reform, or in your management of the party, and there you're talking about the party chairman, Zia Yusuf. And then you talk about why you went on to become a candidate in South Derbyshire, and you wanted to help destroy the uniparty system. And I think that's an extremely accurate description of what we're up against. And you were very pleased about the defeat of the Conservatives, which you just mentioned. You say Labour was obviously going to be the next target. And then you'd had to completely reconsider things. And the first thing you talk about is the fact that the party was not democratic. And the inference is, although improvements to the democracy in the party had been promised, these hadn't materialized. So if I just give you that as the first chunk, as I've picked it up, what's your response? What was so bad in the party that you were having to specifically comment on the lack of democracy?
That goes back to the September conference at the NEC. Nigel had a vote at the conference for a constitution. If you actually look at the constitution, it means that only really the board who Nigel will at a point can then say that Nigel can be challenged. Okay, so there is no system by which anybody who was the leader, not just Nigel Farage, but anybody who was the leader, could be challenged or removed by the membership. Now, also, my branch members made this point. I didn't notice it at the time. They said, why is it that only the attendees institution published beforehand, yeah, so that everybody could have a look at it and discuss it, so it could be debated. It was dropped in there at the conference, and only the attendees of the conference could vote, not the membership as a whole, right? So even though this constitution has been adopted, it's only been adopted by a small minority of the membership of Reform. When you're involved with you sort of things are brought about by people above you in the management system. So you have to take them on board. In retrospect, I realize that Ben Habib was right. Ben Habib has made the point since that he wanted Nigel to democratize the party. As a matter of fact, he even joined because he told Richard Tice that the party needed to be a more democratic party because that way it would represent the people better.
Joe, if I may just break in here, just to clarify for the audience, Ben Habib was deputy, was a dual deputy leader for Reform. You will know better than I do, but I think we need to clarify his position.
He's deputy chair, deputy leader, basically the second in command to Richard Tice until Nigel Farage comes back on the 3rd of June, out of nowhere, after saying that he wasn't going to get involved. When the September conference, constitution was voted on by the attendees only. Yeah. Now, this constitution made clear that only a board that would be appointed by Nigel Farage could allow a challenge to Nigel Farage as the leader of the party. So it essentially meant that only Nigel's appointees and his friends were going to be the ones who were allowed to say that Nigel could be challenged as the leader of the party. Well, that means his position is unassailable. Yeah. In all practicality, he cannot be challenged. That's no good. That's not democratic. That's not the way any party should be run. So, in hindsight, Ben Habib, who was the party chair, who's also deputy leader, who had got involved with Reform on the proviso when talking to Richard Tice that they would democratize the party. As soon as the general election was over, Ben was given the boot and basically replaced by Zia Yusuf. Now, at the time, I simply thought that was a reshuffle. Yeah, I didn't take that much notice of it. I thought it was a reshuffle simply because Ben Habib had not won his seat in Wellingborough. Yeah. Looking back on it now, I see that Ben Habib's removal was entirely due to his demand that he'd made for quite some time that the party be democratized. And Nigel was not going to have that. Nigel didn't want the party democratized. He wanted it as his fiefdom, for him to rule as he pleased. With Zia Yusuf being his, if Nigel Farage was King John, then Zia Yusuf is his Sheriff of Nottingham.
This is fascinating because it's a description which I'm going to say to the audience I can understand from what I've witnessed happening around UKIP and Nigel Farage's position. So the democracy side, you see Ben Habib go. There was another gentleman with it. Was it David Ball?
David Ball. David wasn't pushing for the democratization in the same way as Ben was. Ben was the big man when it came to pushing for democratization. And I think that's why he was flicked off. He was got rid of because he posed too much of a problem, because he is very popular amongst the activists and the membership. He really is. Yeah. And that's still to this. As a matter of fact, he's more popular now. With everything that's happened with the Rupert Lowe situation, Yeah, it's Ben was the canary in the coal mine way back when. Yeah, so we're talking back in June, back in July. It was Ben who was saying that we were going to have problems.
Right, okay. And later on later in the letter, you of course mentioned what had happened in Derbyshire, and you've really given us an overview of that in your introduction. But in the remainder of your letter, you were constantly referring to other people who had concerns in the party and were speaking out. Um, and let me see down here, you talk about the resignation of Howard Cox at one stage.
For exactly the same issues. Yeah. For Howard Cox, the problem was not being able to mention Tommy Robinson. Um, Now, as I've said before, I'm not a Tommy Robinson man, but I can see why, for a great many people who vote Reform, Tommy Robinson is somebody they have a great deal of sympathy for and who they support. And for Howard Cox not to be able to mention Tommy Robinson is, well, that's far too controlling. You know, when you have a real democratic party, you need a lot of robust ideas. Essentially, politics is about the exchange of ideas and ideas being put into the marketplace and everybody talking about them. That's how you find out which is the best idea. And to be able to turn around to somebody who's a leading light in your party, and Howard Cox is, because don't forget that Fair Fuel campaign that he runs means that he has an awful lot of popularity even before he stepped into Reform. So you've got this leading light, this man who's well known, this man who's not being too provocative. All he's saying is what's happening to Tommy Robinson is wrong. Yeah, and people should look into it. Now, for Reform to then turn around and say, "Whoa, we're getting rid of you. We don't want you to talk about that. It's time that you went." That to me is far too controlling, especially for a party that's supposed to be about free speech. And that's what Reform, that's one of the things that Reform stands on, is that we want free speech. We don't want to be told what we can say and what we can't say. Yeah. And for them to turn around to our own leading lights and say, well, do you know what? We don't like what you're saying, so it's time for you to go. That's wrong.
Let's just end because there's a couple of critical, um, very short paragraphs right at the end. You say, and I'll read this out for you. It's clear to me that your drive for the professionalization of reform is actually a drive for Toryisation of reform. And you end here by saying, I did not join Reform UK to continue the treacherous government of a parasitic ruling class who, nested in London, have neither love nor loyalty to the British people, their customs, traditions, law, or religion. I pray that you, and you're referring there to the chairman, that you and Nigel Farage fail in your endeavour to mislead the British people. So, Joe, powerful words from you. You're not mincing your words in sending this letter into the party. And do you want to add anything for the audience following those statements?
What I would say to the British people and to anybody watching this, regardless of where in the world you are, is that I have now come to the conclusion that we have, certainly in England, a class in London who see it as their way of life to manage and to manipulate the ordinary people. And I think that is evil. And I stress the word evil because it is opposed to everything that is good, everything that is truthful, honest, generous, and courageous. I look at the people who run this country in the City of London and in Whitehall and in Westminster, and I just see a bunch of criminals, liars, and frankly, people who are quite happy to see other people die in order for them to achieve their goals and their aims. And I want to stress that. I mean, it's not just our local, as it were, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland um, uh, way of life that's being challenged here. This political class, this bureaucratic and corporate parasite class, extend their tentacles to places like Libya, like Syria, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, and now like Ukraine. They cause mass murder in order to advance their program, their ideology, which I believe is only about power and privilege and pay. It has no other ideology than that. Now, I could go more metaphysical about it, but I won't. I will stick to the principles that, as far as I'm concerned, these people who run our country, not just our country, but the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, I believe that the Anglosphere is run by people who have a Friedrich Nietzsche ideology, which is that God is dead and there is only the will to power.
I agree with everything you've said there. I certainly couldn't disagree with anything you've said there, Joe. And if I think back to my early days, so I've mentioned right back to the beginning of UKIP, I was looking at material which was essentially describing the organised breakdown of UK. And one particular book, it's very difficult to buy now because it's very expensive, but you can actually get the PDF online, was Christopher Story's book, which was entitled The EU Collective Enemy of Its Member States. And in the first few pages of that book was a table, which the footnote said that the information in the table had come from a KGB defector who was Yuri Bezmenov. People can find him on YouTube. But essentially, the table described an attack that was to be carried out on Western society, first of all to demoralize it, then to destabilize it. And the final part is to have total breakdown, whereupon a new society would be formed. And that was actually called a normalization process because that happened to be a term which I think originated in Soviet ideology. But sat with a cup of tea, I went through the table and I could literally tick off each thing as it was happening. The breakdown of education, law being made inconsistent, victimizing the victim, the military being destroyed, the introduction of the homosexual agenda, every single thing in the table you could tick off. And as a recently retired military person, I thought to myself, the country is clearly under attack. I regarded it as subversion. I didn't believe that at that stage we could pin down who was ultimately behind the policies, but you could nevertheless see these very destructive policies. And so the words you've used, possibly some people listening or watching this interview might think that's a bit strong, but for me, this is absolutely the case. We've got a system, we've got individuals and ideology attacking UK, but as you quite rightly point out, their tentacles are unleashing this unbelievably cruel agenda in overseas countries. And in Ukraine alone now, we've clearly got well over 1.5 million casualties, dead and wounded as a result of their policy. So that's really our starting point, isn't it, for a discussion on what's been going on in UK politics.
I was born in 1966. Okay. So as a boy, I would watch my favorite films were either cowboy films or war films. So I'm brought up on that ideology that we fought the Nazis and with guns and tanks and warships and aeroplanes, and that it was a real kinetic war. Yeah, that's what we were brought up to think about how we fought and defeated our enemies. I now realize that the war that we are now involved in, which in my view has, is a continuation in a way, of that Second World War. Yeah, it isn't involving tanks or aeroplanes or warships. It's far more subtle. It really is about mind control and controlling the way that the masses see themselves and see life itself. And that's what I think that we're dealing with. And that's why I think sometimes people don't realize um, the way in which this management and manipulation that has happened to our country has been done in such a surreptitious and secret way that they have all they can see is how slowly and incrementally, in that sort of like Fabian society fashion, you know, our world has changed. And they can't really put their finger on it. And they, because it's not tanks in the street, because they don't have to take up arms and, you know, you're fighting the enemy and shooting bullets at him, they don't know how to respond to it. And I mean, I'm just the same. I was, you know, my ideology has changed over the years. Now I recognize the subtlety with which we are being manipulated and controlled. Now it's a very English way of doing it. Yeah, it's a very advanced way of doing it. And you know, people shouldn't underestimate the English. Yeah, very clever race of people. Yeah, and whereas we may have to have gone out and used gunboats 100 years ago, we've found different ways of controlling people that don't involve gunboats. And of course, nowadays we have this new phrase, soft power. Soft power is mind control. And that's the top and bottom of it. And that's what we're dealing with. And that's why the British people as a whole have to go back into their own history and look at their own traditions and their own ways of life that even only maybe 3 or 4 generations ago we lived, that gave us this healthy bedrock of life that led us to enjoy life better. Yeah, we're not enjoying life at the moment. Most people aren't. They're having to work too hard. And this has come about not because the Germans crossed the channel. This has come about because of an ideology that has now infected the ruling class and is now being passed on to the rest of the people in this country, which means that all of us are having to struggle in our daily lives in a way that we shouldn't have to do. You know, if you go back to, say, Harold Wilson back in the 60s, talking about the white heat of technology and how life was all going to be better for us, and how boys like me in the 70s used to watch Tomorrow's World and think, well, won't life be great? Because everything will be so much easier. Technology will make life so much easier for us. We'll all have so much more time, so much more time to enjoy ourselves. Not the case. We all have to work so much harder to get, well, to put a roof over our heads. You know, and never mind about the breakdown of the family. Crikey, you know, the family is the joy and the ambition of all sensible men and women. You know, for me to be able to come home and of an evening time sit down with my wife and my children and enjoy my dinner and have a laugh and a joke and hear what they've done today and what they think and what they've been watching and all the rest of that normal family life, that is the best part of my day. And it should be the best part of everybody's day throughout this country and throughout the world. Family life, your wife, your children are the best things that you have. And to think that we all have to work so hard and spend so much time away from those people, you know, to get what? Bricks and mortar, a motor car, you know, or go on holiday somewhere fancy. You know, that's not the real deal. And I think we've been taken down this, we've been led into this hole in the ground by a Pied Piper ideology that has led us into darkness, and we don't realize that we've been led in there. And we have to get back outside into the light, out of the caverns, and learn to live again. And that is really the essential part, is learning that family life and that other human beings are the best things in life. and not things. And I think that's the real crux of the matter. And that's really how they've learnt to control us, is by materialism and saying that material goods are what you really should be aiming for, as well as the sort of like the hedonism of personal gratification through sex and drugs and rock and roll, you know?
Yeah. Job, you've covered a lot there, all of it pertinent, and I'm going to say we're definitely getting amongst that. Before we do, I just want to draw us back a little bit to the fact that you've started out, describing how you've left a political party. You've been disappointed and you've left a political party. And I'm very aware that there are many people out there that are looking to the alternative political parties as a sort of um, life buoy to save them from the system that you describe. So many people, thousands of people have spent probably millions of hours trying to support parties like UKIP or the Brexit Party or Reform in order to fight back against the political system. And I can imagine that many of the people that have put time into these parties are pretty sensitive when, I'll say we, because it is you and I, we start to discuss problems within these organizations. Because I think some people think, oh my goodness, just when we start to see progress, just when we start to see a fight back, then here are people criticizing parties that are trying to do the right thing. And I think we need to discuss this because my intention, and I'm sure it isn't yours, my intention in having this discussion is not to cut the ground out from people that have put a lot of time and effort into trying to challenge the existing system. I think the key thing which I'd like to do is inform people in a way that they can see who the enemy is better and how it actually can attack them and manipulate things which they assume are one thing, but in reality it's something completely different. So if we come back to your experiences of reform, you've picked up pretty strongly, of course, on Nigel Farage and his leadership of the party, and you've also picked up very strongly on the chairman, Mr. Yusuf. And I was very interested when I saw a party chairman coming into post who's got a professional background with the banking system. Um, Goldman Sachs is part of it. I can't remember who the other one, Merrill Lynch or something like that.
Merrill Lynch.
Yes. And a person who, in coming to the country, I'll say to his credit, in 1980, goes on to be partner in a company with a value of about 230 million. And when he sells it, he makes a cool 30 million. But my brain says to me that this man cannot be in touch with what life is like on the ground for the average person who's having to work and probably man and woman, husband and wife, partners working full time in order to have a house. Reform with Nigel Farage brought in a party chairman who seems to me to have been part of the very establishment that we might point a finger at and say has been causing the trouble. Do you think that's unfair if I point a finger at this man and say, what exactly is he?
No, I don't think so. But it's not just Zia Yusuf. You know, Zia Yusuf could be anybody. He was put in place because he is a Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch city boy. You know, he's there. I have no doubt that Nigel Farage didn't pick Zia Yusuf. Nigel Farage was told that he had to pick Zia Yusuf. All right. The powers that be that control Nigel Farage have put Zia Yusuf into place. A lot of branch activists will say, "Oh, if only we could get rid of Zia Yusuf, everything would be all right." No, it won't. because Nigel and Zia both work for the same sort of people. And the problem we have is what you just mentioned there about ordinary people not having a say. The problem we have in our country, and it's in every country, is when you get to a certain level of materialistic wealth, yeah, you're so cut off from what it is to be ordinary, to worry about paying the mortgage, to worry about paying the electric bill. You have no idea what it is to be an ordinary person. And so, the idea that the troubles of ordinary people are not that important to you. You have no empathy with them. Yeah. And that's what we're dealing with somebody like Zia Yusuf. He's a rich kid. He doesn't know what it is not to be a rich kid. He's been involved in City of London enterprises since he's been in his 20s. All right. So from being a young man, all he knows is how to get the easy money, and it is easy money. There's no two ways about it. Yeah. And that's what he knows.
Well, no, that's interesting analysis. So I'm going to bring in Tice at the same time. I've got some additional comment about Mr. Tice, but isn't he another one? Isn't he another person that's come into the party largely, it would seem to me, as a result of wealth?
With Richard, you've got somebody who did carry the party along, yeah, and it did use his own money to keep that going. I don't get me wrong. I'm not going to kick every rich boy, yeah. I'm not going to kick every public school boy and say, I'm a grammar school boy, but I'm not going to kick. I used to kick Stowe boys when we used to play rugby against them, but I'm not going to kick them just because they're public school boys and they're rich kids, right? I'm not saying that every one of them, yeah, it cannot be patriotic and cannot have integrity, yeah, and a sound moral and ethical view of life, right? I'm not going to say that, but what I am saying is, when you have people who are removed from the ordinary way of life, then there's no two ways about it. It's going to be difficult for those people to understand just how important ordinary, practical solutions are. They can live in their ivory towers, because they literally do live in ivory towers where you only have to go into London to see. Yeah, that's where those people live. And they don't know what it is. They're not interested in what it is. As a matter of fact, for some of them, and unfortunately, I think for an awful lot of people, they'd rather not be associated with the poor. That's a bit beneath them. And it's a tragic thing. And for me, it does have a religious connection. When our Lord says, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit," that's because those of us who are poor in spirit have to call upon God, to find the strength to carry on, because we don't have the power, we don't have the money. When you have power and money, you don't sometimes need God, and that means you also don't need ethics and morals, because you simply have power and money.
A really fascinating comment. A lot there.
Am I moving off the subject again? I beg your pardon.
I knew this would be an interesting discussion, because in having a brief conversation previously, it was just so apparent there was so much to talk about. But at the moment, I just want to stay on the issue of parties and party politics, because I think this is a very important thing to try and help wider audience understand what is going on, and also maybe what we see that other people don't quite see. But if I go back to my time in UKIP, I looked to see where was a party that was challenging what was happening. And for me, a lot of the poisonous political agenda that was coming into the country at that time was clearly coming from one place, and that was the European Union. And the European Union power was being promoted in UK. It was clearly, if it was unchecked, going to have massive impact, not only on our constitution, but also on our system of law. We could become a completely different country overnight. And therefore, for me, a lot of my focus was in believing that a lot of the danger was coming through the European Union. And the only party that was really standing up against that was UKIP. So I got involved. And in my brief time with UKIP, I did a lot of work. I canvassed, I put out leaflets, I did all sorts of things. But at the same time, I was digging into areas myself. And one of those areas was looking into the political charity common purpose. And I'm talking to you about it because a few minutes ago you were talking to the audience about how you saw the psychological attack on the country as being very significant. So if I go back and I'm talking the early 2000s, I've got to the point where I think I'm allowed to say I was from a military background. I got a certain amount of knowledge about intelligence analysis in various areas, and I believed I was witnessing deliberate subversion within the country. And my analysis was evidence-based. I was dealing in documents, freedom of information requests. And very early on, I attempted to get the UKIP leadership to pay attention to what I was talking about. And in particular, I was looking very early on to get Nigel Farage to pay attention to what I was talking about, because I assumed that he would actually be really interested when I said, look, I can demonstrate at least one of the ways in which our society is being attacked. But to my surprise, he would never engage. I never did get to sit down with Nigel Farage and talk about what I was seeing, even though at one stage I had quite a lot of connectivity in the party, and I was getting other quite senior people in the party to engage. So I'm going to say to you, Job, that at that very early stage, I was fascinated as to why Nigel Farage would not engage with me when I was putting factual documentary evidence on the table about how the country was being subverted. And before I add a little bit more to that, I'd pass it back to you, for comment or an explanation as to why I might have got that response from him.
I did have a little crisis of conscience with my resignation letter, and I had joined a political party for the same reasons as you. I've joined Referendum Party, UKIP, and Reform, and that's because in myself, I wanted to do something. I've always been of the opinion, want to effect change, you have to get up and go and do it yourself. And that's why, as you say, I'm not interested in trying to cut the ground from underneath people who want to be involved in politics. Yeah, I want everybody. As a matter of fact, I wish more people took time to study politics and to think about politics, because it is so important in our everyday life. So I'm not interested in that. I join political parties because I want to affect change. I want to make something happen. And then when you come up against party structures and things that happen in political parties that don't make sense, and they don't make sense because you think, well, surely this is a sensible thing. I'm telling you a sensible thing. Let's go. Let's follow this sensible policy. Let's try and do things and support people who are being good. And then when you see things happening in political parties that don't make sense, yeah, when good people are kicked out or maligned, or when good policies are ignored, yeah, when things that you should be following up are just displaced and left to one side, you begin to think to yourself, well, you think, oh, well, it must be me. I mean, I'm not in control, so I'm a part of the party, but the leadership have got a better idea. The problem I have now, when I wrote my resignation letter in February, and I had this crisis of conscience, is that I've come to the conclusion that it is a possibility, and this is a possibility I want everybody to think about, that as soon as any political party in this country begins to get traction and begins to affect any kind of popularity and change, it is co-opted and it is controlled. Yeah. And we are all being manipulated all the time through these political parties. And that's the worry that I now have. Those are the ideas that over these last few weeks, I'm beginning to consider and contemplate. Yeah. And what is the resolution if that is in fact the truth? And I don't know what you think about that. So you tell me what you think about that position.
I agree with that idea that actually what we've got going on is some very simple, in some ways, sophisticated in other ways, control of the political system, not just through the established mainstream parties, Labour and Conservative, but actually targeting any other party that dares show its head in order to challenge what the uniparty system, Conservatives, Labour are doing. I think this is absolutely correct. And this is why, going back to your resignation letter, it was just uncanny for me because I read what you talked about in that resignation letter, and then things came back into my head. As an example, um, you talked about the fact that when people in the Reform Party were doing good work and they were making progress, they were then undermined or abandoned. And what came into my head was, I can't remember the exact year, but it was the year when UKIP had tremendous success in the local council elections. And in Plymouth, two of the ladies that I'd got to know were the key Plymouth organisers for UKIP, a lady called Carol and a lady called Kate. And they were so buoyed up by the fantastic local election result from UKIP that they were immediately talking to the senior UKIP team and saying, what do we do now? Because we've got the political system moving, people know us, we've had fantastic results. If you like, we've got a breakthrough. We need to reinforce it. We need to get the activists out on the ground now, benefiting from all that good work and success in the local elections. And to their astonishment, these local ladies were told by the senior UKIP leadership, oh, you go away and have some time off and have a rest, have a holiday. And one of them, who was quite a feisty lady, Carol, she said, what are you talking about? We should now be pushing as a party to reinforce the breach and to have even greater success. What are you talking about? We should have a holiday. But nevertheless, that was the policy that the senior UKIP leadership enforced, that all the local activists went into a black hole. There was no further direction from the party as to what they should be doing on the ground. And of course, as the activists were concerned, all of their hard work in the elections then started to break down. It started to sort of dissolve because you didn't have the leadership, you didn't have the direction, you didn't have the enthusiasm from the senior UKIP leadership team. And that particular incident was a key one for me, where I thought, what we've got happening here is a deliberate policy by the UKIP leadership to make sure that where success was taking place, it had limited effect, or that effect was dissipated. So I'll pass it back to you again, but that's one of the key things that came into my head when I read your resignation letter with Reform.
Well, I think that's exactly the case. That's the opinion that I've come to with Reform. And I did see it with UKIP. I saw it with UKIP back in 2018. I saw, going back to the Tommy Robinson thing, there was Gerard Batten had just stood down. Gerard Batten was trying to sort of like bring in the Tommy Robinson element into UKIP. There was a group within UKIP who, under no circumstances, wanted anything to do with Tommy Robinson. The election for the leadership came up, and Richard Brain stood for the leadership. He won with 53% on the first ballot, so they didn't have to have a second ballot. And he stood with the commitment that he would bring peace between the two factions. He said, if you want to support Tommy Robinson, you can support Tommy Robinson. We're not going to kick you out the party. But equally, yeah, I'm not going to pursue Tommy Robinson to become part of the party. Yeah, a perfectly rational, sensible position to take. A really middle of the road position for him to take. He got in. He was voted in. He was in for a month, maybe 6 weeks. And I watched as the NEC of UKIP and the chairwoman, Kirsten Herriot, backed up by the likes of Neil Hamilton and Ben Walker, yeah, and a lawyer that they brought in called Piers Wanchop, did everything they could to make sure that Richard Brain was completely frustrated in what he was trying to do, to the point where he and Liz Phillips just walked away from the party altogether. Now, that to me, not so much at the time. I just thought, well, that's just infighting in politics. That's ridiculous. But now I recognize, because I've seen it in reform, I see the pattern. What they try to do, I think, with political parties, especially like you say, UKIP or Reform, smaller parties, yeah, or maybe I don't know what the other ones are.
Well, the British National Party would be one.
Yeah, but all these parties, I think what they try to do is, as you just described, they get people to a certain point, and then they frustrate them. They realize that frustration is a really good tactic to use in order to stop people being able to advance. Yeah, it's that Fabian society sort of like tactic where if they can frustrate people, put people off, dishearten people, demoralize them, so that they just chuck their hands up and think, oh, well, what's all this about? It's a really effective, it's subtle. Yeah. It doesn't take a lot of energy. All it takes is a few lies here, a bit of misdirection there. Yeah. A little bit of gossip there. It's really easy to affect. Yeah. It doesn't take a lot of effort to do, but you can break down and you can control people's ambitions for what they want when it comes to politics and how people want to live their lives. You can do that. And it's really easy. And when I think about the amount of resources that the state has and that the ruling class have at their disposal to be able to sit down and let's say they have a meeting. And they say, I know, how are we going to control this patriotic feeling that's rising in the country? We've got to do something to be able to manipulate and control it. So there's going to be parties rise up. When those parties rise up, we'll put our people in. And they'll be there to control that opposition. And this is what I've come to the conclusion. All political parties can be, I'm not saying they are, but they are open to the process of controlled opposition by our ruling class. And I believe it is our ruling class that is the problem. And I genuinely think now that what ordinary people have to do is to turn around and think to themselves, do you know what? If I keep on waiting for this savior to come, this savior political movement to come and save me, yeah, you're going to be wasting your time because you're going to be waiting forever. Because it could well be that every political party that comes along can be controlled and manipulated. Yeah. So what people have to do is stand on their own feet, form their own connections, their own trust relationships with people who are local and close to them. I think that is the way to go. Don't bother looking up, yeah, for your leadership. Look to the side. Look to your friends. Look to your family. They're the people whom you can work together with to live a better life. Try as much as you possibly can to avoid relying upon government, upon the state, because I truly believe that the real problem is that class of people who find themselves in the positions of power. I'm beginning to come to the conclusion that those particular positions in life whether it be Westminster, Whitehall, the top of the civil service, whether it be the City of London and Commerce, they they attract people who have a psychopathy, a psychopathic, sociopathic, narcissistic ideology. And that's why we have the problems that we do. And once you've got a civilization like ours that has now turned its back upon its own Christian, Protestant, Reformed ethics and morals, and you have this complete um, hedonism and will to power ideology where all that matters is me, yeah, and there's no greater transcendent power above me, yeah, to which I am beholden. Once you create that situation, which is what's happened since the 1960s in this country, yeah, you've got a ruling class who are without morals, without ethics, don't give a damn except for themselves. And they are psychopaths and they are narcissists and they are sociopaths. And the problem with pyramid systems is they draw the few to the top who are the worst kind of people to rule.
Job, again, I think this analysis is very good. Are we just dealing with political parties? I don't think so anymore. We're dealing with people who operate above and through political parties. I don't think there's any doubt about this. And is there an assembled malevolence at the top of the pyramid? Without question. On my bookshelf, I'm afraid I can't remember the author, but I know he was a a Polish psychologist, and he wrote a book called Political Ponerology, where ponerology is the study of evil. And his book is about how bad people sort of manifest and are attracted to positions of power. I was It was recommended to me many years ago. It's sitting over on my right hand side on the bookshelf, and for me, that's a text which captures a lot of what you say. Now, I would like to do something. I'm actually asking you as a guest here for the UK column because I have never really spoken out before about my experiences around UKIP and Nigel Farage. And I know that if I've mentioned Nigel Farage, over the years, there's always a couple of people that come back to me pretty strongly, and they say to me, Brian, it's utterly disgraceful that you should attack Nigel Farage because he's done this and he's done that. And so I know that if I start speaking about Nigel and UKIP, there will be a little bit of a backlash. But if you will bear with me on this, and I'm very happy for you to be the one who holds my feet to the fire. I'd just like to share with the audience a little bit more about my experience. I just talked about the fact that when we saw progress in Plymouth, it was squashed. And of course, those experiences were reflected by other people across the country, because when I started to speak out and when I started to ask some questions, I was contacted by other UKIP activists, a lot of them who'd been with the party a long time from other parts of the country. And they said the same thing is going on here, Brian. And that told me that the shutdown of successful activism within the party was coordinated to such an extent that it was being done across the party. But I'll stick with the fact that in my early days, I was warning about subversion in the country. I was warning about the political charity Common Purpose. I'd started to give public talks. Those public talks were always documentary evidence based. And I'd started to get a lot of support from people who were UKIP supporters. And indeed, if we just mention the British Constitution Group as well, when we put on those big events looking at the attack on the Constitution and law and order in these wonderful islands, we had a lot of people from UKIP. They formed a core support base, both for the UK column and the British Constitution Group. So I knew that what I was talking about was of interest to the bulk of the party. a party membership, which was why we were able to attract such huge audiences. But at no stage could I get the senior UKIP team under Farage's leadership to engage with what I was talking about, and indeed other speakers, many of them very well qualified, particularly in the Constitution, were talking about. So eventually, it gets to the position where relations between myself and Nigel Farage were frosty to non-existent. But what then happened was that I was banned from attending the more major UKIP events, the conferences. I was actually banned. And this then really started to make me wonder what was going on, because I've always been measured in the way that I've spoken out on things. I've always been evidence-based. But UKIP leadership under Nigel Farage would not engage with a word that I said. Off to one side, at that time, the British National Party was still working, and I got invitation. I think I spoke at 3 BNP events, and I have to say, I met some wonderful people. I did not meet any violent extremists. I met just people who were very concerned for their country. But what fascinated me was that the BNP leadership not only was keen to understand what I was talking about, they, without me asking, they ended up promoting material where I was warning about subversion in the UK, and in particular the use of this political charity. So I'll come back to you, Joe. That was where it got to for me, that in speaking out and saying, look, this is what I'm seeing. And I came from a professional background. I came from a military background. Nigel Farage not only would not engage with me, he banned me from attending the major UKIP events. There has to be a reason for this.
I think there is, and I think right. I'm going to go metaphysical on you. Right, as far as I'm concerned, life is a choice between good and evil. Yeah, and I genuinely believe that these very people that I'm describing as parasites, vampires, psychopaths, yeah, who run our country, do so because they, in a materialistic way, let's say, rather than a metaphysical way, they believe in evil. They believe that it's quite all right to lie. They believe that it's quite all right for people to die as long as their advantage is advanced. Yeah. I believe that they're quite prepared to rob people, to deprive people of their wealth, to take it off of them unlawfully, cheat them of it. Yeah. I believe that these people see that as their right. Yeah, they're superior beings, so they have the right to do this to you. Yeah, and I see our political class as a materialistic manifestation of an evil that I'm afraid mankind has to live with. You know, and until our Lord Jesus Christ returns, I'm afraid we're just going to have to knuckle down and deal with people like that. And this is the process that we're all involved in. People like you, people like me, people who are watching this program, because if they're watching UK Column, that means that they are aware that something is going wrong and they want to find out the truth. Yeah. You don't come to somewhere like UK Column because you're happy with GB News or you're happy with the BBC. Yeah. It's when you're unhappy with the BBC, you're unhappy with GB News, that you come to UK Column and places like this because you know you're not being told the whole truth and you need to find out the truth. There's a feeling inside of us. And I believe that that's a spiritual reality that exists in human beings. Yeah. Some of us do have this inclination to need and desire the truth. It's just something that's visceral inside of us. We've got to have it. We need to discover it for our own peace of mind, for the contentment of our own souls. Unfortunately, there is also the opposite. There are people who have no interest in the truth whatsoever, who would rather lies. They prefer the lie. And, the sooner the people realize that it is that kind of a conflict that we're dealing with, it's not just straightforward conservative Labour. Yeah, it's not Democrat Republican. Yeah, it's not that straightforward. It is far more profound. And I think for a lot of people, that this dawning realization that the uni party, as we describe it now, has become common parlance. Yeah, it's used far more now than it ever was when I was young. Yeah, people are beginning to understand that it doesn't matter who you vote for, the government always gets in. They realize, I mean, you've got the likes of Dominic Cummings talking about how the the secretaries in the bureaucracy are actually deciding what the agenda of the government is going to be, and the ministers are simply the sales reps. Yeah, they're just presenting it to the people, and I think that's the position that we've got to now. And I don't know if I did. You want me to go more into the this? I'm fascinated about this book you were telling me about, by the way, by this Polish author about evil, because that's how I see it. I genuinely see this as evil manifesting itself through a pyramid structure, like Pharaoh, yeah. And I believe that the likes of us are Israel, and that we are trying to escape from this pyramid structure that is trying to control our lives.
This is fundamental stuff we've got into to here. We've got to at this point, and I'm very happy to talk about it more. Before we do, let's just put a little bit of a line under the political side, because we've put some pretty hard comments into the airwaves about what's happening within politics. I don't think anybody would challenge the idea that it doesn't matter whether you vote Labour or Conservative, red or blue. You are in fact voting for a uniparty system where the same policies will be continued through each successive government. So there's the pantomime of an election and all of the electioneering, but the reality is that the individuals may change and their colour may change, but the centralised policies continue, and those policies are clearly designed to absolutely wreck this country. And just to qualify that statement, of course, we've heard the phrase "build back better" being used. So the implication is that we've got to build something better than existing. But I've reported many times on two politicians. Danny Kruger was one of them. The other gentleman's name's gone out of my head, but they were on public record saying that the Conservative government at the time planned to bring in what it called creative destruction in the public services in order to herald in a new system of politics and a new sort of nation state. And they were vilified. Danny Kruger, who was a parliamentary candidate at the time, he was deselected. The other MP, embarrassing myself because I can't remember his name, but we'll make sure it goes up in the notes. He also talked about this. And alongside that statement of creative destruction, I've got to say, I was one of the few people warning at the time about a wider government agenda to use what it called disruptors in order to get into the institutions and the civil service to break down a stable, productive management system in order to make it easier to introduce whatever the new agenda was. So we have seen absolutely the intent to break down society. And anybody who is trying their best to fight back against this I'm going to say we, because I think it's reasonable. We are saying keep going. So we are not
Absolutely.
saying we're not saying stop. We're saying keep going. But whatever party you're in, um, understand what is actually happening around you, because you need to understand it to be effective. And your key point I want to reiterate there was you said instead of looking up for this savior to arrive, whether it's Nigel Farage or it's Donald Trump or it's Elon Musk, wherever he's come from, we should be looking left and right to our fellow men, our fellow man and woman, in order to deal with good people, whatever color or background, who also see what they're fighting. Um, I just wanted to put that as a baseline in before we move on to discuss some of these more spiritual aspects. But do you think that's a reasonable summary?
I think that's a great summary. And I would just like to add one point to it about the way in which the country has been broken down. We have been deindustrialized in a shocking way. And it doesn't matter whether it's the Conservatives or the Labour Party that have been in government, we are being deindustrialized. Yeah. The shutting down of the steel plants, the shutting down of our coal, our energy. You only have to look at the potholes in the roads. Take a look at our high streets, all shutting down. Yeah. Um, it's just one it's one attack against our whole way of life. The fact that our water isn't any good, the fact that our food isn't any good, the fact that we can't even feed ourselves, it's just one thing after another. So I did want to make that point about the practicality of how it doesn't matter who we vote for, we're getting the same problems. And of course, the main issue of the day is it. Even though we voted for these conservative governments, even though we voted for Brexit, we get even more mass immigration, which is just compounding the pressure on everyday life. So let's move on to the spiritual now, Brian.
Well, I'm going to say I just want to respond to that one because, of course, immigration is such a hot topic, and I always enjoy looking at the camera and saying, if immigration is upsetting you, then start to research where the migration policies came from. Where has all this mass migration come from? And a man that UK column has pointed at over the years is the late Peter Sutherland, Sir Peter Sutherland, who was the UN's ambassador for migration. And he's on public record as effectively stating that we, presumably the United Nations political masters, we need more mass migration to break down the homogeneity of the nation states. So, what we were being told very clearly was that migration was going to be used as a political weapon to not just break down the UK, but to break down the Western states. And of course, that is happening. We're all suffering as a result of unsustainable immigration in this country. 600 odd thousand people came in last year, according to the government statistics. But those people being used as a political weapon, and many of them suffering themselves, and their home country suffering from the loss of labour and young people. I felt it was so important to say this, Joe, because so many people want to look at migrants and they are the enemy, when I think we've got to look deeper as to how they got here. As I said at one BMP meeting, and it was very interesting how the audience reacted to me, because I asked at one point whether people were concerned about immigration, and they certainly said they were. And then I asked the audience, how did they get here? And initially there was silence. And I said, well, this is a simple question. Did they fight their way ashore? And again, there was a big pause. And then a man, a very big man at the back of the room, shouted out, no, we let them in. And he used an expletive with it as well. And I then said, oh, you let them in. I've always wanted to know who let them in. And of course, that produced a pretty explosive response. where we started to discuss who had opened the doors for this policy. And then I just asked another question. I said, okay, if you know you've been betrayed by your own members of parliament, is the enemy the people who've betrayed you or the people who were invited in? And it was fascinating to see how we then got a proper debate going in that. The BBC, of course, would have branded it an extreme right-wing audience. That's not what I saw in those people. But we did get a proper debate about immigration, having spelt out where the problem had come from in the first place.
Oh, I agree. I mean, that's one of the tweets I've just put out recently is again going back to this idea that I have about a parasite class, a criminal class who run this country from the city, from Whitehall, and from Westminster. They are the real enemies of the English people, is London. Yeah, that's the problem. If we could just make ourselves more county, if we could just take power back to the shires, we might be better off. But so long as these people who are at the top of the pyramid, I go back to this pyramid symbology again, as long as those people are sitting there in London and telling the rest of us what's good for us, we are going to have problems. And it won't just be immigration, it'll be transhumanism, it'll be, I don't know, doing away with cash, all these things that we're all having to struggle with, all come back not to the symptom, which is, you know, lots of Pakistanis and Indians and Nigerians coming into the country and putting pressure on our nation because we just can't house them. It's as simple as that. But the real traitors, the real enemies, are people who look just like us. Yeah, they're as white as you and I are, and they're as English as you and I are, and they're sitting there down in London, and they think they have the right to destroy our lives because they've got a better ideal. Yeah. And we should just do as we're told and, crawl up into a corner and die somewhere, basically, because I think that's basically what they want for the majority of us. And they are the real enemy, and people need to focus that is where the enemy is where the power is.
And let's just end by reinforcing that point with Tony Blair made a completely open and publicly reported statement at one point that his intention was to create a new political class who would be appointed.
That goes back to your common purpose thing, which you used to talk about years ago, which I used to listen to, and the post-democratic society. Yeah, that's what they were. That's what they were pushing. They were pushing this. I mentioned this to a customer one day about common purpose. I've been watching one of your things, and I happened to just mention it. And this is in Milton Keynes, yeah, and this is at least 15 years ago. And they said to me, "Oh yeah, they're the new Masons. Common purpose are the new Masons. They're the new way in which you create a class of people secretly to control everybody else."
That's very interesting, Joe. But I'm watching the clock, and I think we need to come to a close in a minute. But you brought in the spiritual aspect, which I think is so critical. And I'll say to the audience that at the weekend, I got the opportunity to do a little interview. I've still got to edit it, so it's not available yet. But I spoke to a gentleman called Ross, who has been very active with the church down in Cornwall. And he was describing to me how the Church of England system in Cornwall is being absolutely dismantled as a result of policies which are particularly coming through the Bishop of Truro, Bishop of Truro's office. And what does it involve? Well, it basically says we have no money, we've run out of money, and therefore we can't pay vicars. And therefore, well, unfortunately, you can't have a vicar per parish per church as the traditional system. What we're going to have to do is have one vicar for several churches. And that could be 3 or 4 or 5 or 10. And if you're worried about what the pastoral care is going to be, well, don't, because we're going to bring in amateurs. We're going to bring in members of the public who are going to step in and fulfill the traditional role of the vicar. And Ross took me through a lot of detail about what he could see. And ultimately, he's saying to me, Brian, the Church of England has now unleashed a policy to destroy churches across the UK. And it was a fascinating interview, and I've got to say that what he was talking about was making complete sense to me. I also pointed out to him that in research work that the UK column had done, we had Archbishop Welby at the time very excited that he was working with international bankers and hedge funds to raise 17 trillion to support the gay green agenda. So we can't put roofs on churches, we can't support the poor in the parish, but we had the Archbishop of Canterbury drinking champagne with the likes of Christine Lagarde and others to say we can raise 17 trillion. This can't be accidental, Job. This has got to be calculated, destructive policy from the very top of the Church of England.
Absolutely. I mean, I call Justin Welby Justin the Bastard. Yeah, because he is, by the way, and his father was personal secretary to Winston Churchill. Yeah, Justin, before he became a member of the Church of England, no, before he became part of the clergy, yeah, was involved in trading in the City of London. So you see where this man is coming from. He has no interest in spiritual well-being of this country. He has no interest in saving souls. He has no interest in telling men, women, and children about Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is the way in which you learn to have a more abundant life, a healthy life, a happy life. It's a fact. All right. For those of you who aren't religious, don't worry about it. It's just a fact. Go and buy yourself a Bible and think about things. Read the Bible, think about things. You will find that Jesus Christ is the man. Yeah. So when you've got somebody like Justin, yeah, coming along and hollowing out the Church of England, because that's what he was put there to do. As a matter of fact, I think one or two of them before him were also given the same job. But essentially, it's about hollowing out our spiritual life. When I was a boy, in our village, there was a post office, there was a couple of pubs, and there was the church and the school. Yeah. Those are the things that make living in an English village one of the most wonderful places to be. Yeah. And if you take away the church, you take away the spiritual heart. It's bad enough that the pubs go. Yeah. It's bad enough that the post office is gone. Yeah. But you take away the church and that's it. All you have is a collection of houses. And I don't think people realize that. And I think people, it's beginning to dawn on people that you need that church in the middle of that village by the village green. Yeah. In order for a village, a community to have a real heart, especially for the English people, the Scottish people, the Welsh people, the Ulster people. We are a Christian people. It's in the very essence of who we are. Everything about our history and our traditions and our customs is based upon that Christianity. And when you get somebody like Welby, who's from that vampire parasite class again, yeah, who they have nothing but contempt for Jesus Christ. I genuinely believe a great many of them are real 100% Satanists. And I mean that when I describe Satanists, I'm not just talking about Anton LaVey and walking around with a pitchfork or, I don't know, running about nude in the middle of the night and all this kind of carry on, right? I'm talking about people who genuinely believe in Satan's promise that they can become God. Yeah, that they can have their own will to power, and they can be own um, their own spiritual world is all to them, and it's all about imposing. It's all about them having their will all the time, every time. Yeah, and they see no reason why you should ever do anything good unless it pleases you. I believe these people think that they can live forever through transhumanism, that they can defeat God, yeah, that they can do what they want, and they never ever have to submit to a moral or ethical higher order in the transcendent as God. Yeah, that they never have to. And this is the important point I'd make about Christianity. They never have to have faith. They never have to turn around and put their lives in God's hands and say, "All right, God, I'm beat. You know, I can't do this. You're going to have to do this. I'm going to rely upon putting my future in your hands." That's the wonder of life. That's where real life is. These people don't want that. They never want to be grateful. They never want to have to hand over their lives to God. They want to be in charge all the time, and they want to impose their will upon every aspect of their life and everybody else's life. And that is true Satanism.
Very, very interesting comment, Joe. And I'd like to continue this.
Me too, Brian.
So I hope that you'll come back because there's so much to talk about, both politically and spiritually. But there's two things I'd just like to say before we part company to the audience is that if you're out there and our comments about reform and UKIP or BNP, whoever else we've mentioned, if you're feeling that your feathers have been ruffled and that we haven't quite been fair, then I hope that you'll come and join us for a part two about this, because I feel the time has come for me in particular to take the gloves off in respect to what I actually see going on in the political parties. So that's my challenge to the audience. If you're finding this one is not to your taste or you're feeling a bit upset, don't disappear. Come back for round two, and we'll see where we get to. And the other thing I'd like to say is that if anybody is perhaps not well, is not spirit. I'm going to deliberately use the word spiritual, but doesn't quite understand why you, Job, have started a home in on matters spiritual and Christian. Just think that in 2025, UK is a country in which prayer is now being banned, in which a country in which you pray and you can end up in court, you can end up in prison. So prayer is apparently so dangerous, it's got to be banned. And there's a reason for this. And to understand the reason why the government thinks that prayer is so dangerous, in my opinion, echoes back or reflects back onto the things that you've just been talking about, because they're frightened of prayer because it's the prayer which directly challenges their malevolent spiritual position.
Absolutely right. I think people don't recognize how important prayer is. I mean, I always say there's two things that a Protestant needs. I am a Protestant. I make a big deal about being a Protestant, right? And the two things that a Protestant needs is King James Bible and prayer, because prayer is the way in which we connect with that transcendent power that is our Father in heaven. And they don't want us to connect with our Father in heaven. They want to keep us unconnected, yeah, with the transcendent, with our Father. They want us all to be orphans who they can abuse and beat, and nobody and we can't have a connection with our Father. Yeah. They want us not to know our Father. They want to keep us trapped, encaged, and beaten down. Yeah. But when you know your Father, when you know your father's there and he's on your side, then that gives you hope. They don't want you to have that more than anything else in the world.
Job, thank you very much. So, from reform to prayer, I think that's a pretty interesting discussion in a bit over an hour. So, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining me. It's been a really fascinating conversation. I've extended the invite to you. I hope.
More than happy. I
Brilliant.
look forward to it, Brian. It'd be great.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Brian. Goodbye.